What's up, YouTube? Welcome to the Accounting Wisdom Podcast. I wanted to kind of give a spin on basically um, the importance of the Old Testament and, the problem with just having that grace only mentality. Now, I'm really not focusing on the grace only mentality argument in this podcast. I'm more just wanting to really say how important it is to listen and read the Old Testament, just because there are so many good truths that still apply today. And I think that if you kind of have this grace only mentality and you're kind of living life like, I don't need to study the Bible, I just, you know, I confess Jesus as Lord and Savior, and so, hey, I'm good. Well, then you can have this mentality that, hey, I'm only going to read the New Testament, and, you're only going to read, certain books in the New Testament, and you miss out on all of what the Old Testament has to say. Not to mention, just the wonderful stories of Old Testament saints that are in, the early books of the Bible. And so, I think this is coming from, I have a video that if you're interested in more study, there's a sermon that I really like that the pastor isn't a law-based kind of like this legalistic pastor. He's really a grace pastor, but he mentions the importance of the Old Testament, and he talks about how to be blessed, and he comes from the standpoint of the importance of the Old Testament. So if I remember, hopefully I do remember, check out the description box of this video and you can see a link to hear that sermon. Also, if you're on that channel, that pastor has a great series on the book of Revelation. He also has a video on the tree of life. It's in the playlist of the book of Revelation. There's a few book of Revelation playlists, but there's a big playlist that has 66 videos in it, and he goes through the whole Revelation. And towards the end of that playlist, there's a one called Tree of Life that I've talked about a little bit, and it's kind of an interesting little spin on, what the Tree of Life is. And so check that out too. A little bit more nuggets for those that are interested. But anyway, going back to just, I believe there is blessing and peace that we can have from just revisiting the Old Testament. Hey, we know that it is summed up in love, and we know that we have to have faith in Jesus Christ. And we see what blessing comes from just the New Testament alone. New Testament tells you how to get to heaven. It tells you more about heaven. It tells you a lot of things that the Old Testament doesn't have, right? And so, not to really pit one against the other or put one against the other. I'm not really trying to do that either, but I'm just trying to emphasize the importance of the whole entire Bible. And I even notice this in myself, is that, sometimes when I'm choosing what to study, I go to the New Testament a lot, and I go, to read, some of my favorite books in the New Testament. And I think this is just a reminder, I've made this podcast before, but, the Old Testament is so important. I think that, especially if someone is coming from the standpoint of not really familiar with Christian and Jewish tradition and background, I think that, going to the Old Testament, you have that importance of what the sacrifices meant, the animal sacrifice. And you see the importance of the temple, just a little bit. I mean, I think obviously we would get more, actually being Jewish back in that culture, we would actually understand more. I think not every Jewish person really, paid attention, as much as they could, but, at least they, had that foundation. And so, anyway, when we go to buy a Bible, we don't normally just buy the New Testament. When you buy a Bible, you buy the whole entire Bible. We rely on, those that have put together the Bible, different people who were moved by God or inspired by God to accept or reject certain books that they felt could be in the Bible. I have read the Apocrypha books, and not all of them, but some of them. And I think it's worth just reading for sure. But, I do believe in just the, importance of the Bible that we have. And I think coming from the standpoint of just trusting God, that it wasn't people who decided, what should be in the Bible so much as it was God who placed certain direction in a person's heart that said, hey, we're going to only have these 66 books, and we're going to only put these in the Word of God, and they call it the canon, and this is what is inspired by God. Now the Apocrypha books, I believe, like, I've heard a pastor say, is that there is, something we can gather from it as far as, just, I take it to be as from this standpoint. What I'm about to say is, if I were to read a non-Christian book, or if I were to watch a non-Christian movie, if I'm so willing to do that, then I can look into some of the Apocrypha books. But anyway, this is not about the Apocrypha. I don't recommend, those books, especially for a new believer. But, just I wanted to mention those just from the standpoint of how we got our Bible today, and, the ministers who have decided on what books are inspired by God and what books are just, something that isn't verifiable, and it is not consistent with the teaching of Jesus. But anyway, books like Deuteronomy, books like Genesis, are just so important to go back to. Reading about Adam and Eve in the garden, reading about the book of Ruth, and what they have experienced in their walk with God, I think is helpful. Reading, the book of Kings, when I first read the book of Kings, I was like, wow, this David is a really great man of God, and just learning from his life, you learn, like, wow, it's important to be strong for the Lord. It's important to really fight for the Lord and be on the Lord's side. And so, even going, reading a kid's children's book, I think a lot of those stories are just good for even children, to learn about God, I mean, especially, the book of Genesis, states right in the beginning that, God is the one that created, earth, and God is the one that created man. and animals and all that we see. And we learn in the New Testament that God has created things that we don't see, the invisible spiritual realm. And so, I think as we study the New Testament, it's important, to really not forget, the Old Testament in our studies. I think it's important to, read parts of the whole entire Bible throughout our week, throughout, each week. Of course, I'm not saying this from a legalistic standpoint, like, hey, I'm telling you, you have to read the Old Testament, every week or something like that. But, overall in general, I just wanted to make a reminder podcast about that importance. It's important to mention the law. I think, like the book of Peter says, that some of Paul's teachings can be confusing to unlearned people. And I think it's important to remember what Peter said about Paul, in that, you can get confused and think, okay, so I'm a Christian and I'm a New Testament believer, so, I'm supposed to avoid the law. I'm supposed to avoid reading books like Deuteronomy and Exodus and Numbers and Leviticus. And that's so false. We're not going to go to hell for reading the Old Testament law, right? And I think I've even heard teaching out there saying, like, hey, if you even read the Old Testament law, like, and you try to do things like, not sleeping with your aunt or something, and you're practicing some Old Testament law, like, you're saying to yourself, oh, the law says this, so I shouldn't do it. And if you're practicing that, then you're going to go to hell because it's in the Old Testament law. And that's just kind of a weird example, but no, we can gather teaching and righteousness from the Old Testament law. And I think I wanted to emphasize that too, in the importance of the Old Testament, is that, we are supposed to look at the law. I'll read what Jesus said about the law. He said, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so, shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven." That's Matthew 5, verses 17 through 20. And so I believe that is pretty clear, that the law and the prophets still play a role in our New Testament life today. And especially if someone is struggling with something like homosexuality, and they're like, well, God doesn't really say too much about this, or Jesus doesn't really say too much about this. Well, you can go to the Old Testament law and see that God, if he called it an abomination, then there's no way that God today, because his son Jesus died on the cross, that he no longer thinks that is an abomination. And you wouldn't think that we would have to even say something like this to call these things out as wrong, but you actually do. People have, all different types of thinking. The New Testament doesn't mention anything about bestiality, sleeping with an animal. You can't find any passage that specifically says that in the New Testament. And so, for whatever strange, crazy, evil reason, if there's, out of the billions of people in the world, someone that's messed up in the head that thinks that oh, maybe I can do this. Well, they would have to go to the Old Testament to really see God's position on this. And so that's just another extreme example to say that, the Old Testament still has application today, and the law still has application today. Paul's message is just that you can't just follow the laws and reject Jesus Christ and still expect to go to heaven. And so the Jesus Christ still plays a role in our life. And so I just wanted to mention that. And anyway, thanks so much for checking out this podcast. Hopefully this was helpful to someone. Hopefully that you got something from it. And I will talk to you on the next one. See ya.